all of these research that are growing in the field, as well as clinical research that's showing that practices that have known to activate the vagus nerve is leading to, changes in our brain, bodily physiology. Yeah, because it's a bi-directional pathway, right? So the vagus nerve carries this information to the brain, and then the brain in turn sends information to the organs as well, right? So then once that information, so that's why when we engage in practices like meditation or certain kinds of breathing practices, the vagus nerve knows, okay, the heart rate is down. So it sends that information to the brain saying, okay, no need to panic, right? Things are fine. And then the brain sends the information back into our muscles, our motor systems, our heart, and then the heart rate goes down. So we have to also think of it as like a loop, right? It's not just vagus nerve carrying information, but then that information going back down to the organs, right? And so, that's okay.
Welcome to the Mindful Rebel podcast, your refuge for personal growth. We're all on a journey to reconnect and nurture the most authentic parts of ourselves. And in this podcast, we explore how these modern day rebels are using mindfulness to transform themselves and the world around them. Each episode will dive deep into personal interviews with social impact healers, teachers, creatives, and leaders. Through their stories and insights, you'll engage with powerful teachings to spark your mind, prompts to ignite your reflection, and techniques to integrate wisdom into your daily lives. Make sure you like, subscribe, review, and share this podcast while joining us at the intersection of mindfulness and social change that challenges the status quo, awakens our collective wisdom, and creates a world with peace, clarity, and freedom.
Welcome to this new episode of the Mindful Rebel podcast. Welcome or welcome back for those community members who, you're just always in it for the great conversation. You are in store for another great conversation. I have the privilege and honor to have conversation with Dr. Abha Rajbhandari. He's going to join me. We're going to chat a little bit and talk about all the great things that she does in her work, and actually learn a little bit more about you too. So Abha, thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you, Sean, for the invite. It's a pleasure. And, we were just chatting, but I've been following your work as well. And so it's really nice to connect in your platform. Yeah.
Thank you. And it's the same. You mentioned this, but like social media, it can be a dumpster fire sometimes. And it also has been a godsend in connecting folks together in a way in which sometimes time and space doesn't always give us the opportunity to do so. So I'm just excited that we're able to actually connect. And I've just stalked your Instagram page and liking all the dope stuff you're posting, but we can actually be in conversation around it. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So a great place, I think, for us to start is maybe talk a little bit about your journey and your interest in the work that you do as a neuroscientist. I find that it's such a beautiful intersection of the work that you do from a yogic and spiritual perspective, and then sort of meshing the science of it all together. So can you talk a little bit about how your journey came to be?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I'll start from the very beginning. So I'm originally from Nepal. I was born and raised in Nepal. And so growing up in Nepal, out of the two sisters, me and my younger sister, two girls, I guess, in my family, there was a lot of pressure because we didn't have any boys in the family to sort of, I think my dad was compensating for not having boys by trying to turn us into boys somewhat. And so there was a lot of pressure in that sense on the level of academics. And so he wanted us to excel in academics and all of that. And coming from the South Asian community, right? Like he wanted us to be independent women and all of that. And so that was drilled in my head that I had to be good in academics, right? Yet my mom was very, I would say, religious in the sense like she spent a lot of time like meditating, doing pujas, rituals, and all of that. And in a way, I think growing up, I was a little bit conflicted because I loved understanding things. So I had this like scientific knack, I would say, for things like I would ask a lot of why questions, like why this, why that. And my dad, he would call himself an atheist. And so I was conflicted because my dad's like, do your work, do excel in academics, and that's God. And then my mom's like, no, we have to go to the temples, we have to do all these rituals. And so I'm like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, right? And so I think I chose the path of logical understanding with things and went the science route. So I moved to the US for higher education, right? For better opportunities and all that. And so I moved here for my undergraduate. And so when I came here, I was actually, might be surprised, I was actually a physics and engineering major. And I was doing, the first year in my undergrad, I was doing okay in my calculus classes, but I was getting C's and D's in my physics classes. And I'm like, how am I going to become an engineer with these, not so great grades? And so that's when I was like, that's the beauty of being in the US educational system, that you can try different options, right? And so I became an undecided major actually in my second year. And I just took a bunch of different classes. I took philosophy, I took some psychology courses, and then a few of the biology, which were focused like a neuroscience course. And I was doing all of this, and I loved understanding in the psychology course about the brain, the mind, how it works. And I think that was the beginning, the seed of where I was like, oh, it would be great to understand the mind, right? Like the age-old question. And then when I took this neuroscience course, the teacher was really amazing, and she really instilled this like curiosity aspect. And so that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to change now from undecided and become a psychology major and a minor in neuroscience for my undergrad. And then I went on to work in a lab at University of Michigan because I didn't have a lot of research experiences. And then that's where I knew I wanted to go the research route, and then applied for graduate school, and then got my PhD at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I studied stress biology, right? And so that's where the connection to yoga slowly started, because I was very stressed myself, even though I understood stress biology. Graduate school was very tough. And so I needed a practice or something where I could turn to manage my own stress. And then I did my postdoctoral work at UCLA in further advancing my knowledge and understanding of the biology of stress. And then now, I'm a faculty, right, at Mount Sinai Hospital. And it's interesting. And I feel things have come kind of full circle at this point in my life because, I looked at spirituality and aspects that I grew up with a lot of like questions and stuff. And then now I'm finding as humans, we have this wanting to understand what we're made up of at that materialistic, objective, right, biological level, and why we exist. And so that's what science fulfills in that way, right? It's a path of knowledge for that. But then spirituality, I also consider it as a path of knowledge, but to understand the aspects that science cannot touch, right? Like aspects of who we are, internally, what makes us who we are, all of that. And so I feel like science and spirituality at this point in my life are like a yin and a yang. Like I need both, right, to be fulfilled. So yeah, long answer, but it kind of captures all of that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it was perfect. And what's coming up for me is that, I think specifically like in the spiritual wellness, mindful landscape, whatever umbrella term we want to use, that there's been a lot of movement to talk about and share like what's going on in the scientific space around these practices. And then also still realizing that they are a form of wisdom all in themselves, right? That like we can hold both together and like they actually work together. And I think sometimes we like, no, I just want to know about the science part. Some folks are just like, I'm just in this, like there's a there's a mutual connection there, and I like how you phrased it as like as a yin and yang, and how we can connect sort of the spiritual and the scientific. Now, one of the things I always say, when I'm working with students or talking with folks, is that I know that there's a lot of information on the internet about like what things can do and what practices can do from the lens and voice and work of a neuroscientist. Like for our yoga, what is it that our yoga practice what does it do for us that really helps us from a neuroscientific perspective?
Yeah, really good question, and actually very timely question, right? And so, as I mentioned, I study stress, and we live in a very stressful world, right? We're bombarded with stressors of all kinds, a war, climate change, all of this. And we're in this right now moment where I think managing this chaos in a way that's outside as well as our mind, right? Our minds can be very chaotic because of all the stressors, external as well as internal. And so I think one of the things that has become much more clearer to me as I've walked this path of both science and spirituality is that, in fact, all of the practices in yoga are actually, they are not geared towards basically helping our body and our physiology and all of that, right? That's just a pathway to try to understand the ultimate goal of like understanding who we are, or this connection to the higher self, we can call it, or consciousness, or Brahman, whatever you can describe. And so a lot of times the effect, I do want to phrase it by saying that a lot of times the effects we are measuring with science are more like side effects of the practice or the spiritual dimension of things, because we see changes in things like heart rate, right? Alterations in heart rate. So if we're stressed, our heart rates can be very high, our breathing levels can be very high, or we may be holding our breaths, things like that. That's known, right? Like, for example, stress related conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, panic disorder, all of these involve alterations both in our brain as well as our bodily physiology, right? At the level of our heart, our lungs, our gut, all of those. And so it's really interesting because even in the field of neuroscience, aspects of brain and body were studied very separately, right? Like cardiovascular changes were not studied in conjunction with changes in the brain, because it was thought that brain controls everything and that's how it went. But now we're also in a stage in neuroscience research where there is a need to understand how is the brain even receiving information about our bodily physiology, right? Like breathing and heart rate and gut functions and many others. And we're understanding that the brain actually is a pretty boring organ without all these information that are coming in, right? Once these sensory information come into the brain, then the brain creates actions or reactions. And so one of the main things the path of yoga does to answer that is bringing this balance of the brain and the body, or the homeostasis, we can call it, or equilibrium, right? And so that's a major, and it's a big sort of way of looking at things, but at a nuanced level, right? Our brain and body is connected by many different systems, right? There is sympathetic nervous system, which is activated when we are stressed, right? Like all the increase in heart rate, the breathing rate, all of that is associated with the sympathetic nervous system. And then the counter to that is the parasympathetic nervous system, which then brings rest and digest, calmness, and that is modulated by this nerve that connects the brain and body called the vagus nerve. And so the vagus nerve pretty much like innervates all the organs in the body, but most of the information it carries is from the body to the brain, almost 80% of that information. And so that's why yogic practices like certain kinds of pranayam, not every kind of pranayam, but certain kinds of asana practice, and especially meditation practice, brings the parasympathetic nervous system into balance, then causing the sympathetic nervous system to come down, and again bringing this again yin and yang, right, balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic together. So yeah, that's what I would say at a big picture level. That's what the path of yoga can give us.
Nice. You know, you actually touched on a point that I wanted to sort of bring up, because I like to watch the yoga landscape, the meditation landscape, and I know that there has been, I want to say in the last maybe 3 to 5 years, this uptick in conversations around the vagus nerve.
Mm-hmm.
Like everybody's talking about the vagus nerve. From a researcher and scientific perspective, what's prompting this sort of surgence around the conversation of the vagus nerve? Is there new research coming out? Is like there new findings around that? What's pushing this to like the top of the cultural zeitgeist?
Yeah, really relevant question as well. The reason, I think there are 2 or 3 sort of reasons. One is, I don't know if you're familiar with the polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, which is talked about a lot in the yoga world. And that theory sort of states that, the vagus nerve is at the center of many different physiological behavioral changes that we experience. And then there is separately in the field of neuroscience itself, this research area called interoception is really picking up, and it's one of the highest growing fields of study right now. And what interoception itself means is the way the brain senses our body in a way, right? So basically our brain receives all these sensory inputs which are related to temperature, breathing, heart rate, pain. All of those sensations are sensed by the brain, right? And so, but what had been missing is how exactly is the brain receiving this information, and what happens when these information pathways are altered. And what came to be known, this was known long time, centuries ago, but now this research is picking up, is that the vagus nerve is the major pathway that carries all this sensory information into the brain, right? And so because there have been also research related to yoga as well as other mind-body practices, I would say like Tai Chi and other practices, which have shown scientifically that when you engage in these practices, the vagus nerve pathways it affects is actually altered, right? So that means alterations in heart rate variability and things like that. And so there is that, I think, combined with the interoception field, which a lot of gut related aspects, now we know, right? A lot of our mental health is determined by our gut health. And so alterations in gut, for example, the bacteria that are in our gut, as well as the foods that we all eat, all of those can then inform the brain about how it should function. And even that information from the gut that goes into the brain, the major carrier of that information is the vagus nerve. And so I think all of these research that are growing in the field, as well as clinical research that's showing that practices that have known to activate the vagus nerve is leading to changes in our brain, bodily physiology. I do want to add one point. Sometimes there's confusion though, is that the vagus nerve, we have to understand it as just like a highway, like a pathway that carries information. Ultimately, it's the brain that decides, right, what is the action or reaction that it has to engage in. And so the vagus nerve itself is not something that can cause changes, right? So we have to, I think that's one thing that's always confusing, or I hear people saying vagus nerve or the parasympathetic nervous system regulates everything, but it is the brain that regulates everything, because vagus nerve is only like a highway or a pathway that carries these information. So just a point of clarification.
No, and I want to say thank you for that point of clarification, because I'm one of those people that are like, as I've heard it, it's like the parasympathetic nervous system or the vagus nerve is the thing that's doing the work. So from what you're saying is that it is the parasympathetic nervous system, the vagus nerve, they provide the information for the brain to then make action that would be something that would calm us or help us relax or a little bit or move into that space. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, because
Okay.
it's a bi-directional pathway, right? So the vagus nerve carries this information to the brain, and then the brain in turn sends information to the organs as well, right? So then once that information, so that's why when we engage in practices like meditation or certain kinds of breathing practices, the vagus nerve knows, okay, the heart rate is down. So it sends that information to the brain saying, okay, no need to panic, right? Things are fine. And then the brain sends the information back into our muscles, our motor systems, our heart, and then the heart rate goes down. So we have to also think of it as like a loop, right? It's not just vagus nerve carrying information, but then that information going back down to the organs, right? And so, yeah, that's a
Yeah,
very good. Mhm.
yeah, thank you for that clarity. Yeah, I've definitely heard it the other way, and I'm like, no, that makes total sense. It's like it's the messenger that gets the brain to do the things that we needed to do. So thank you for sharing that. And I actually think that, the question I wanted to follow up with you is, you know, are there instances where practices like yoga or other mind-body practices aren't helpful to help us work with or mitigate our stress responses?
Aren't, right? Is that your
Mhm.
question? Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's a very good question as well, because sometimes we think yoga is this like cure-all pill or some kind of like some kind of treatment that we can use to calm ourselves down or get rid of all our problems and things like that, right? I've heard also being used like that. And so that's a very important question you're asking, because there actually can be certain negative consequences of not practicing yoga or aspects of yoga, right? Like for instance, meditation practice itself for someone who is very anxious, who has a lot of anxiety, for them to sit down and do a meditation practice like as a first thing can actually cause more anxiety, right? And I don't know if you've experienced this. I've definitely experienced this when I've tried to sit down for meditation as a first sort of thing when I'm very anxious or stressed. It can actually bring up like a lot more stress because, I can then sense my body, like my heart is beating. And then that I think causes that like reciprocal sort of reaction that, oh, I'm panicking, and then, feeling that. And so that's definitely shown scientifically, right? Like in some people, even with PTSD, meditation practice can actually lead to feeling more anxiety or anxious. And same goes with certain kinds of breathing practices, right? Like this is why aspect of yoga has to be practiced in some and not just one aspect, right? It also goes into showing that, because for example, certain kinds of breathing practices within pranayam, like, there are breathing practices that actually activate the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Like the anulom vilom or the alternate nostril breathing. But there are practices which increase sympathetic nervous system or increase heart rate, right? Like Kapalbhati, for example, right? Like which increases. And so this is why you cannot just move on into your day by doing Kapalbhati, where you've increased your heart rate and then you're like, oh, I did my pranayam practice and move on. That's why you have to, this is again, I love the yin and yang example that applies to everything in life, right? Like that balance, because you do the certain kinds of asana practice as well, like headstands or others, which again are activators of sympathetic nervous system, because when you are inverting, the heart rate is going up. But then you do counter postures or asana to bring your body and physiology and mind into that calm state. Same with pranayam. You do ones that activate the sympathetic nervous system, and then you do ones that then cause activation of the parasympathetic. And same with meditation, right? Like there are certain kinds of meditation, right? Like mantra practice, chanting, different types. And some work for some people, some don't work for others, right? And so we just have to figure out what it is, because it's not a cure-all for everyone. And the world we live in, I think we just have to find that balance. And then the other important thing is that we actually do need sympathetic nervous system, because, that's another thing, we need the sympathetic nervous system, right? Like as species, our evolutionarily, it has helped us to stay safe from different kind of dangerous situations and to be able to react appropriately in a particular situation that we feel we're in danger, to move away from that danger. We need the sympathetic nervous system because that allows us to escape the danger, right? The fight or flight reaction is the sympathetic. And then we also need the freeze reaction, all of that, right? So this is why I would say, also want to emphasize, because people just, sympathetic nervous system gets a bad rap because, they're like, but we need sympathetic nervous systems to survive, right? So that's what I would say. Again, looking at with that angle of all the practices as what it is doing, and then what is the counter, if it's increasing my heart rate, if it is causing changes in, in terms of how I'm perceiving the stress on hand or the anxiety levels, then there are other ways of like trying it out and see what works. Yeah. So that's what I would say.
I want to thank you for naming all that you just said, because there's so many things that I'm like, I want to name that you mentioned that sometimes and I say that we put a lot of weight on these practices to be, like you said, like a cure-all or like a end-all be-all of our mental health or our physical wellness and well-being. And in reality, it's like, we probably just need a multi-pronged approach. Like, yeah, I go to yoga, and then I got some other things that I do, and then I go to a counselor, and then it's having this space that we can tap into different practices and modalities as we need it. And then the other piece I want to mention, thank you for naming the fact that like the sympathetic nervous system does get a bad rap. It's like, because we kind of need that. If that activation actually helps us do things, it's just like the issue is like when we're not meeting the other side of that equation, right? Like we're continually active and we're not balancing out to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And I don't often hear people say that. So I want to appreciate you for naming that.
Yeah, I think it's important, right? Because we need both, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to, a thread I wanted to pull out, what you've been sharing, is you've been mentioning like parts of yoga, right? Like the idea that, again, yoga is way more, it's a multi-limbed way of being, more than just a physical practice. And so as you are continuing to engage in the work and resources that are the research that you do, what are your thoughts on how practitioners can continue to invite in the full practice of yoga, right? Because I know that and I work with a few different yoga teacher trainings, and I, get a chance to work with folks that are moving into the teaching space. And sometimes they feel a little overwhelmed to like, I got to include all this because this is all part of yoga. And it's like, well, yeah, it's all part of yoga. We're just seeing the physical practice is just 1/8 of this whole equation. And so maybe what's your advice to practitioners or space holders that maybe want to look at how they can integrate the fullness of what yoga is?
Yeah, very good question as well. Your questions are amazing, by the way. It's some things I love talking about as well. So it's so yoga as a whole, right? So there are many parts of yoga. So obviously the 8-limbed path of yoga, which includes, I would say 4 aspects that are focused on the outside or our body, and then the 4 aspects that are focused on the internal, right? And so even obviously we can't include every single aspect all the time, but from a scientific point of view, the research I'll bring in, right, that's showing that has the most beneficial effect on health, for example, is minimum that includes asana practice, and pranayama practice, especially the ones that bring, that parasympathetic nervous system activation. And meditation is the must, right? So even if it's 5-minute meditation, whatever it is, I know some people do yoga nidra, end with that, or some do just the shavasana practice, whatever. But that has to be, it has been shown with research that meditation is the critical component for any beneficial effects on the health, because they've compared, there are studies that have compared exercise alone with exercise plus meditation, or aerobic exercise plus meditation, or ones that include asana plus meditation, or meditation alone. And always the combination that has exercise plus meditation or meditation alone has the most beneficial effect for things like heart rate, bringing the heart rate down, for breathing, as well as these measures of depression or anxiety scores, right? Where people can score and say, how are you feeling before taking, going through this practice, and now how are you feeling? And as well as in short-term practitioners, or not, people who are new to yoga practice, comparing them versus advanced yoga practitioners or meditators, they found that when there is a meditation component involved, there it has the highest benefit, right? And in fact, we know, like, advanced yoga practitioners, some of them, they don't even do asana practice, right? For example, like we know certain rishis or gurus who don't do that. And because a lot of the 4 parts of the Ashtanga yoga or 8-limbed yoga, which are focused on the outside, are a way to prepare our mind, mainly our mind, to then get into the higher states, right? Like the pratyahara, the one dharana, the one-pointed focus, then dhyan meditation comes after that, and then samadhi, right? So all of those are preparations for the body. So asana is a preparation, pranayama is a preparation, yama niyamas are, all of those are preparatory ways of then getting into that higher state of meditation. So I would say once, at least, the components that include asana, if you do only asana, I think some counterbalance to that with meditation, I think from the research I've seen, would be what I would say. And then from a spiritual point of view, right, if we're curious beings, we want to understand who we are, what's our place, what happens to our body, aspects of death, all of those things, I think we have to sit down at least for contemplation, right? We can't just keep doing practices and then feel this connection, if we want to say higher self or God or whatever we want to label it. I think we do have to sit down, that moment of pause, that moment of calmness or quietness where we are not doing anything, right? I think it's so important, because that's when a lot of time wisdom comes to us naturally, right? Like we get curious, we're like, why are these things happening in the world? Or what is my connection to everybody? All of that. And so I think both from a scientific, research that's showing, as well as a spiritual being, I think sitting down in that quietness, and that can be any form, right? It doesn't have to be like focusing on a light or focusing on a mantra. It could be contemplating on certain questions that arise and just seeing what comes, right? I think I think is a key.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And again, I'm so appreciative of your viewpoint, weaving in sort of both sides, this scientific and the spiritual. And that actually sort of led me to my next question. From your lens of your work and even your own personal experience, like how important is a dedicated practice? Because I hear quite often, when I work with trainees or working with people just in general with coaching, it's like, yeah, we know that there's a lot of benefits to meditation and mindfulness practices and movements, but it's like you actually got to do it. Like you got to you got to figure out what your practice is so that you're into the experience and not just talking about it, but being about it. So can you talk to me a little bit about your perspective on like the importance of practice?
Mm-hmm. Very good question as well, because that's the key, right? The key and the difficult part is doing the practice, right? We can have the knowledge, understanding from science that it can help us, but eventually we have to be the doers, right? We have to engage. And so I'll again bring it from both a scientific as well as spiritual lens. And so from a scientific lens, some people want to know what's the dose response curve of like yoga, right? Like how much yoga do I need to have the most beneficial effect, right? People have definitely asked these questions. And actually researchers have looked at what's the minimum amount of time you need to be engaged in these practices to have the beneficial effects. And so interestingly, research itself has shown, and I'm summarizing, obviously, there can be differences, but the bare minimum that the research has shown is that 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes at night is what has the most beneficial effects on our health and well-being. And so to obviously for even to find 20 minutes sometimes can be challenging for people, right? And so I think there are ways we can break down the 20 minutes though, right? And so I will say because you also brought up personal, right? So there's personal, there's spiritual, there's scientific. So from a science, yeah, we need at least 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes at night at the minimum to have these beneficial effects, calmness, all of that. From a personal point of view, 5 years ago, I took this initiation into a Kriya yoga practice, and I learned this Kriya yoga. And so this practice involves, aspects of a certain asana, and then it has a breathing pranayam practice, and then it ends with a meditation practice. That I do. And I have been doing this for the last, at least in a dedicated way for the last 3.5 years, I would say, morning and evening. So I do it in the morning. As soon as I wake up, I do that. And then before I go to bed, I do that. And so it took a lot of time for me to have that as something like brushing my teeth, right? Or something that becomes so habitual that without it, I feel like I'm missing something, that I'm not complete, right? And so now I'm at a point where if I don't do this practice, even when I'm traveling, right, or I'm with relatives or something, it's very difficult sometimes to find. And so even if it's 5 minutes of practice, I do that, right? I make sure before I go to bed, like I have this calm sort of mind. So that's from a personal viewpoint. From, I guess, yogic perspective as well as spiritual perspective, I think it's not something that, from that perspective, you have to put a lot of thought into. It's something you are, right? And so another practical way I have been telling some of my students to engage in this practice is finding micro moments or transition times where you can close your eyes for, even if it's like few seconds, right? So a lot of times this is what I do when I'm transitioning from going from one thing in the day to another thing. Or for example, after we end this conversation, I'll probably go and start doing something else. But in that moment, that micro moment, I will take a little moment, just a little, for either gratitude, for closing my eyes, and then moving into the next thing. And if you make this a practice, it just becomes like, say I'm like in this mode of like stress, I've been in a meeting that's very stressful, and then I'm going to another thing, then I take that moment to calm myself down before going. And so I would say these are some of the practical ways if you cannot sit down for 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes at night. So yeah, I think it covers, right, all of that.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming the creating like the micro moments, because I feel like
Mhm.
those are so important. And I think I want to say, and probably since the pandemic, especially like we're working from home more and sort of it feels easy to just roll from one thing to the next
Mhm.
thing. And it's been really powerful to be able to like, you know what, when this meeting ends, but when for the next one it starts, I'm gonna just sit for a second, collect myself, reconnect, ground, and then move to the next thing. That's been
Mhm.
a really powerful practice for myself personally as well.
That's
Of just
amazing. Yeah.
yeah. you got to find the moments. You got to,
Right?
find the
Yeah, I think
moments.
there's so much power in that, right? Like right before you start something, when you do that, you take the time, it just prepares you, right? From that brain body physiology perspective, but also like spiritually, right? Like you are ready to grasp, you're ready to take in what is to come now, because everything is uncertain, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the next moment, but at least we are preparing. Okay, like I'm preparing myself for this next moment, and then let's see how it goes. Yeah, I love that you do that as well, right? I think you're so right that you bring up like we're always like, and I used to definitely be that, like just check things off my list, and I need to get this done, I need to get this done, move from one thing to another, eat, at my desk, and like just, kind of run from one thing to another. And we don't need a lot, right? Like just these tiny small moments, when we do that, it just brings a sense of calm throughout the day. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. One of the questions, I guess, the last question I'll ask you is, are there any resources that have been sort of influential or important on your own journey that you would want to share with the listeners? It could be like a book or, anything in general, but is there anything that's been helpful for you? I know a lot of the folks that listen to the podcast, they're like seekers of information and like paths to sort of go in their next level of exploration. So any recommendations?
Yeah, I will tell you, like, so right now I am really into Advaita Vedanta, right? So non-dual Vedanta, which means basically everything is non-dual, right? Like there is the aspect of consciousness where, it describes consciousness as this one thing, and your consciousness and my consciousness are actually the same thing, and that's what connects us. And so I'm really actually feeling that a lot of times, even with the things and aspects of like all the changes that are happening in the world, the things that are not in our control. How do you explain that? And so for me, that has been like a real, I guess, saver in terms of finding these moments. So I will say, reading the book I Am That by Nisarga Datta, that was really life-changing. I am in the process of finishing the book, The Talks with Ramana Maharshi. The Talks, yeah, that's a really good one, which, both of those are Advaita Vedanta perspectives. And I listen on my commute to work. So I live in the Bronx outside of Manhattan, and I work in Manhattan. So I have like a 45-minute commute to work. And every day on my commute, I listen to the Vedanta podcast, which where Sarva Priyananda, if you know Swami Sarva Priyananda, he is a very, very good speaker, and there's so much clarity in the way he explains very, very concepts that are very, sometimes feel very, like vast. He breaks it down really well. And so yeah, I would say Swami Sarva Priyananda's The Vedanta podcast is a great one, so that I listen to every day on my commute. And I've been going back to Bhagavad Gita. I've read it a few times, but now because I teach a science and spirituality satsang on Saturdays through Tejal Yoga platform, I have gone back and looked at every shlok or verse in Bhagavad Gita from that lens of science and spirituality, right? And a lot of times, I will turn a page if I'm really stressed or something, and whatever page it's on, there is some kind of knowledge there, right, that I can use. And so that's what, I would say are some of my like go-to things right now. And, from a scientific, if you're inclined to learn more about the science of consciousness and stuff, there's also that aspect where I think Vedanta philosophy and the science of consciousness at some level it is meeting each other, because, some aspect of science is also saying that consciousness is actually a fundamental principle, and that our brain and body are just expressing that consciousness. And so basically there is one consciousness, right? And so if you're inclined to get into that, actually Sarva Priyananda has had debates with certain consciousness scientists as well. So those are good ones to get into. You can get into a rabbit hole of that. But there is a book called Reality Plus, which I've been reading as well, which talks about like everything sort of is an illusion, and how, at a deeper level, we're all the same and things like that. Yeah. So those are some of my at this moment, like go-to resources.
Great. You just added some books to my book list and some podcast listens too. So thank you.
Never ends, right? The knowledge
Yeah.
path. I would love to learn about yours as well.
Yeah. I mean, right now, what I'm reading a lot of Bell Hooks' work
Okay.
right now, just to sort of lean into that, and some Buddhist texts that are sort of calling to me. I've been reading a little bit of one of the translations of the Dhammapada, just
Mm.
to sort of like deepen my connection to that work, and a little bit around the Bodhisattva path
Oh,
that's been, and then
beautiful.
it's been a lot of comics and manga
Oh,
too, that
yeah, we
balances a
need
little bit
that.
of
We
that
need
out.
those
So
too. Yeah.
yeah.
I know. Like people say yoga is your hobby. To me, sometimes I'm like, yoga is my life, right? Like it's part of my life, but I have hobbies, right? Like I like to dance and all of these. And so yeah, I think it's so important to not just feel, right, that this is something that becomes like a pressure sometimes, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, Abba, this has been a great conversation. I'm just, yeah, this was dope. Thank you for taking the time out and just being in conversation. Um, you shared a lot. Like I was sitting, I got a little notepad over here. I'm like, whew, this bad boy is full. So thank you for your wisdom, and your grace for just joining us and being here on the podcast.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. It's so beautiful. And the questions you ask, like they're all in line with like where my state of mind is right now. And so I think these, I hope like your viewers, all of them can really tap into, right, some of this aspect, like the questions, right? As a form of curiosity. And obviously I don't have all the answers, and it could be like a starting point for your own curious journey or some other thing. So yeah, thank you. It's such a pleasure.
Yeah. For my listeners that want to connect to your work, what's the best way for them to learn more about what you got going on?
Sure. I mean, research wise, I have a research website, right? And then a lot of times because, it's a hospital work and some of that is not like shared. But then I have an Instagram profile page, right, called NeuroBreathe. And so sometimes I like to share about science and spirituality, some topics that come to my mind and try to break it down. And so yeah, if there's any questions or anything, I'm happy to engage in conversations. So yeah, people can reach me there as well.
Perfect. For those that are listening or viewing, click down in the description. The IG page will be there. Do yourself a favor, follow. Yeah, listen, thank you again. This has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate you and everything that you share with the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I do too. Thank you so much, Sean.
Hey, Rebels, thank you for joining us on another episode of the Mindful Rebel podcast. Remember, after this listen, ask yourself where wisdom can meet practice and where compassion can meet action. Take a moment today to reflect on what resonated with you in this episode. Now, if you're feeling that rebel spirit, I'd invite you to like and share this episode. Your support helps spread the message of mindfulness, self-inquiry, and self-discovery. And if you're feeling extra generous, and I know you are, leave a rating and a review of the podcast. It helps others find this resource on their own mindfulness journey. May you move into the rest of your day with a greater sense of peace, clarity, and freedom.